Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are just getting started here with some folks joining from the waiting room. Glad to have you all. I'm Susanna Kelly, and I'm the Chief Experience Officer at McKinley Advisors. I'm really excited to have you all with us today as we talk a little bit about our latest research report, Next Level Governance, Leading with Strategic Agility. I know we've got some more people popping in, but we're going to get rolling because we have a lot to cover today, and we want to make sure we have time for questions and answers and all that good stuff. I am joined today by three leaders in our practice, John Hockman, Tim Hopkins, and Patrick Glazier, who are going to share insights from the research, some case study examples, and some action items about what you might be able to take away from this webinar today to really take your association to the next level. Before we really dig in here, you've got access to the chat and to the Q&A down below on your buttons down at the bottom of the screen. We'll be monitoring both, so feel free to put into the chat where you're dialing in from today. If you have a question for our panelists, go ahead and put that in the Q&A box, and I'll be pulling those forward a couple of times during the webinar so we have some good discussion going. All right, Patrick, I'm going to get started with you. Tell us a little bit about the research behind this work. Why this topic and why now?
Well, thank you, Suzanne, and it's wonderful to be with you all today. This started with an understanding that our worlds had changed and that associations want to be not just a part of that change, but they want to be disruptors themselves. They want to navigate through periods of time like COVID-19 and all of the disruption that we felt, and really be in a position to lead and navigate through all of that disruption. At McKinley, we have the really great opportunity to work with amazing leaders, smart, insightful boards, and it's been really apparent for us for many years that a lot of associations' ability to really affect that change comes from the leadership, comes from the board, the entire governance structure. And we wanted to pull together the best learnings that we possibly could on what sets the board up, what sets visionary leaders up to be successful in that context. The problem that we found was when we were pulling together the available literature on this topic, it really was focused on, the for-profit sector, where what we come to expect from leaders is a little bit different from what we have in the association world. So we realized that wasn't going to quite cut it to lay out the land for association leaders and for them to understand the characteristics that are most important to have on the board. Enter our research. That really was focused on taking a hard look at our sector and understanding what learnings we could find from our sector to inform the community of association professionals.
That's really helpful, Patrick.
This slide will show you who we talked to exactly. Now, on the right-hand side of this screen, you'll see the actual roles of folks that we talked to. Now, we did want to communicate with those that have that space where they're intersecting with leadership and then identifying the conversations that they're having and funneling that to the implementation of strategy. And so in this slide, you'll see that the majority of folks we talked to really were CEOs, 95%. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that other than that, we really tried to take a broad perspective. We weren't just interested in professional societies. We weren't just interested in trade associations. We really wanted the diverse complement of groups that the association community represents. And we got that. We had a really good contingent of professional societies, but then dispersion across trades and hybrids. If you look at the revenue size of organizations, we had a really good number of those that fall, let's say, 2 million or under, as well as every rung up on that spectrum of association revenue sizes, so that we really are able to say something about, what does leadership look like at a really large, and where does it look at a much smaller organization, and to talk to you about that through these results.
It looks like we might have a little bit of a lag on our slide moving forward. So as we're waiting for that, I just want to make a reminder, if you have any questions for our group here today as we're going through, please be sure to put that into the Q&A. We will break in a couple of times with questions and share those out for discussion. So as we move along here, Tim, I'm going to switch over to you. Give us the headline for this study. What does this next level governance really mean?
Yeah, thanks, Susanna, and great to be with everyone. So next level governance, this is the data behind what I think we've experienced and what we're hearing from association executives very explicitly. It's leveraging the muscles that we built and these collective experiences over the last 3 years since the pandemic began. And as we're emerging and being more innovative and trying things and being specifically more agile as organizations, not just at the small scale, at the broader governance scale, we have some very specific examples and characteristics and things that organizations, associations specifically, can apply, can search for within their own leadership today and in the future to be more strategically agile. And you see that the labeling on the screen here, it's this ability to improve your performance, and it's not just surviving and sort of playing defense, but also to thrive and playing more offense amid whatever the disruption may come about. And I think we've learned that we can't just sit back and expect things are going to go okay. We need to play out a few scenarios and have the ability to be more agile as leaders. And your governance models in particular, people in the volunteer leadership, I think there's room for improvement is what we've seen from this report. And so very excited to sort of walk through some of the details today with everyone.
Awesome. Well, John, help us dig a little deeper. So can you outline some of the specific findings that association leaders should be aware of? And more to the point, how can leaders really apply these findings to their governance model?
Yeah, good to be with you all today. I do think that the beauty of this is it's actionable. I think the data tell us very clearly what CEOs can do to increase the strategic agility across their leadership. We've got the building blocks spelled out in this report. Now, doing it is going to take some work, but it is doable. And so let's sort of unpack a little bit of it. What you see on the slide right now is what we heard from this 100+ group of CEOs around ideal board roles and responsibilities. And number one response at 81% is the criticality of board-driven insights into the challenges that the industry is facing. That role, if you will, of being a scout, foresight. We talk a lot about foresight in our community, but that board members have a duty and a necessity to do that interpretation of what's going on in the field or the industry or the sector that their organization is representing, and then pulling that back to board level conversations, ensuring, we talk about the three modes, the fiduciary, the strategic, and the generative modes, making sure that industry insight is coming back and triggering generative conversations that might not have a clear endpoint when they start, but are really looking at critical issues that lie ahead, and where appropriate, based on where those generative conversations go, feeding into strategy. How are we going to address it through the organization when that's appropriate, when that's the conclusion? But if you don't have the people looking for the what's going on out in the industry to begin with, you run the risk of missing things. I think a ripped from the headlines example right now is artificial intelligence. And I think many association senior leaders and certainly volunteer leaders as well are sort of overwhelmed by it. I don't understand it. I'm not smart enough to talk about artificial intelligence, but it is a factor out there for many, many, many groups, all of us. Thinking about how that's impacting industry and bringing it back is really key. And I think a related issue is disruptors overall, and how much time and attention is being paid to disruptors. And I'm going to link part of my example that I talked about a moment ago around AI. When you look at the data here on what almost all associations are paying attention to, major changes in the field, new innovations, financial planning, because almost everyone's financial model is upside down. And then the middle sector that most associations are paying attention to from the study, workforce. Workforce is huge, certainly for the members that you serve, but in many instances also for the association itself, and thinking about how to serve the broader workforce challenges out there. And then only about half are looking at, again, workforce shows up again in a slightly different way, and data and technology shows up here. Now you contrast this data point where specifically we've found in the research, not many groups were paying attention to technology, but a PwC study on the corporate side, 91% of boards are highly focused on technology as a priority. Now, to be fair, our research was in the field in January and February of this year, probably before the AI headlines were most glaring. But if you've been paying attention, as our good friend Patrick Glazer has been doing for us, this is not a new topic. But the association world's a little late to that. Similarly, we've been talking a lot about ESG, environment, social, government. And it is an area where associations are pretty late to the game, and the data support that. And yet, it's really critical that if we're going to build strategic agility in our leadership, we've got to spend more time on some of these issues, even when we don't quite know where to start, even when we can't get our arms around them yet from a leadership perspective. They're really key. And some groups are doing that better than others. We certainly work with lots of different clients in these kinds of contexts. But being able to build a board that has that view of the future and a discipline about bringing it back to board work and dealing with disruptors that come along, really, really key. So we could unpack that a lot more, and I bet we will when we get to the Q&A.
Yeah, and I love the way you talk about having board discussions even when you don't know the answer, right?
Particularly when you don't know the answer, actually, because
right, particularly when you don't know the answer, that you're really exercising that muscle around generative discussions, and it's a great segue actually to jump back to Tim. Talk a little bit more about what does it really take for an association to be truly next level? Like, what are some of those keys for success today, right? Not in 2015, but today in 23 and beyond. What's it going to take, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. Making this, you mentioned it earlier, but the practicality of this research is really important here. So a couple things that jumped out to me. One was this very high focus on strategic leadership that stood out when we talked about these elements that are critical to the success of the board. And I think for many of you who have been in associations for a long time working with boards, it seems obvious that, that's the expectation, but I think it's really glaring how it came back to us in this kind of breakdown here, that, the expectations of how boards are supposed to operate and how they actually operate don't always align. And it's really helpful to have this kind of data when you are having your discussions with those boards about, what expectations are when new people are coming on, of, what that expectation is, and making it as clear as possible. And especially giving you kind of the research to pull them back and get them in that strategic space to have these conversations. And so one other thing we're finding is there's a shift from formality into agility. And this isn't the buzzword agility. This is specifically changing directions at a speed, using the information that's available. And to the point John just mentioned, like having that conversation when you need to have it, not waiting for all the things to be perfect. It's sitting in that space and being more agile and not, again, not being as formal in the process. And it's one other call for boards to really embody strategic agility is having a stronger focus on outcomes over the process itself. And I think partnership also with staff in particular over some of the traditional siloed roles is very, very important. So some boards get caught in the weeds in some of the operational details, and it's very critical that they stay setting direction, being on the front wheel of the bike, as we often use in our analogy when we're doing some of these trainings, to steer and point the organ in the right direction and leave some of that back wheel, that operational tactical things to the staff. And it's really important. So we have some very specific items in here that kind of walk you through those elements that are so critical. One other thing that stood out in some of this research here was diversity, equity, inclusion. This is an area that I've worked in for a long time, and some of the numbers that jumped out were important. So there's 78% of the folks that we talked to in this report are engaged in ongoing discussions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion among their leadership, which is good. You have to have these conversations. But only half, about 53%, have a comprehensive diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. And only 37% have performance metrics and key performance indicators attached to their DEI goals. I think we all know as leaders of associations, what gets measured gets managed. And I think this is an area that I challenge you all and all association leaders to really improve in this space. And I think we have some ideas that we'll talk about a little later, but that 37% having performance metrics and KPIs in this very critical area that is going to lead to, innovation and greatness for organizations. I think that's a big place of improvement that's necessary. And so, couple things that just jumped out. We do have some tips regarding like recruiting intentionally when it comes to board members, and some part of that includes diverse membership. But I think there's a big challenge here for organizations to really step up what they measure when it comes to something as important as diversity, equity, inclusion. And one example of an organization that is doing it well. We just got back from the ASAE annual conference and had the pleasure of getting to celebrate the diversity, equity, inclusion diversity executive leadership program, the DELP program that's been around over 20 years. And the numbers are staggering of the impact that they've had on historically marginalized and underrepresented leaders in our space. Of 246 individuals that were selected and had the honor of being a DELP scholar, 49% of them are now in a CEO or C-suite position. 56% hold the prestigious CAE designation that many of us proudly have on our signatures. 17% are now fellows of the organization, and 10 DELP alumni have served or are currently serving on the ASAE or ASA Research Foundation board. These are hard metrics that show true impact of outcomes that they aim to do in the beginning. And here we are about 23 years into the program where those metrics matter. They looked at these from the beginning, and I think helped that move towards success. So very big example that I think it kind of goes back to some of the things that we're pulling out of the research of that importance of these KPIs and linking back to these important programs.
Tim, I want to just, and Suzanne, with your indulgence, I want to slip in for a second. Tim made a reference to a metaphor that we use a lot. Some of you have heard us use this in other contexts, but I just want to take a beat and talk about the bicycle metaphor. If you think about the mechanics of a bicycle, the front wheel is where you steer, sets direction. The back wheel is where the chain connects and it really powers the bicycle forward. One wheel isn't more important than the other in a bicycle. They both have to be there and they both matter. The comparison here is in a governance system, the board of directors is the front wheel. That's setting direction, mission, vision, strategy, and evaluating performance at a high KPI kind of level. That's front wheel work. The back wheel work are committees and task forces and ad hoc work groups that are put together in addition to the professional staff who are all making things happen for the organization. And it's helpful to understand the difference there. The reality is in a governance ecosystem, many people end up at the front wheel because they've been really good at back wheel work. They've paid their dues, they've done their time in back wheel work. That's fine, except the work at hand is very different. The functions are not the same from the front wheel to back wheel. So thinking about how we work with a larger governance ecosystem in that metaphor. I was with a board yesterday doing a board orientation, and they acknowledged that their board members also sit on a lot of their committees and they do a lot of back wheel work. We don't have to debate whether that's a good practice or a bad practice. It's a common practice in our world. And the metaphor doesn't judge it as good or bad. It's helpful to remind people when they're in different places. Now, how this whole metaphor fits into strategic agility, I think is also important. The bike can pivot and does pivot, but it's got a solid frame, so it's resilient unto itself most of the time. Anyway, I appreciate stepping in there, but I just want to make sure everybody had clarity on that metaphor because it's usually pretty powerful and we hear a lot of good feedback about it. Susanna?
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you mentioned that, John, because there was a question actually that popped up in the chat when we were looking at that slide earlier about the characteristics or the elements of that are critical to success of the board. And Katie had noted, like, this is great, but how do we make this part of our culture, right? So one of those ways, John, is what you've just described, which is to remind ourselves about what is it that I'm being asked to do. I'm a member of the board, which means my role is different than when I am a member of a committee or a working group, so on and so forth. Yeah. So we're going to get into more examples here as we go through. Patrick, I want to turn back to you. I'm curious, we've got a lot of different people on the webinar today. Some folks are from professional societies, some folks are from trades, even some are in hybrid organizations. So did you see any distinctions in the research when it came to those different types of organizations?
That's a great question, Suzanne. And as I mentioned earlier, we were really intentional about making sure we heard from associations in various sectors as well as structures. You know, I was reminded by a colleague a week ago that when you've seen one association, you've seen one association. And there are important distinctions from professional to trade, different sizes, whether we're talking about governance or some other factor. That said, the qualities of effective governance really transcend that professional trade dichotomy. I mean, there were small differences within our data set, but really the greater theme of strategic agility, vision, those were things that associations, no matter the sector that they represent or the structure, the format of the association, valued equally. So it applies across the board. And I think that's because fundamentally, associations are looking for great visionary leaders. Doesn't matter if you're thinking about a relatively small association or one that's very large and global, they're facing the same kinds of fundamental questions. And John mentioned a minute ago, he gave artificial intelligence as a newer challenge facing associations. If you're a global association, you're wondering, just take the case of a professional society representing 500,000 members across the globe. You're probably wondering, you know, how's this technology fundamentally going to change the job and the role of my members? And furthermore, how can we use it within our own association to be more effective and efficient? You need great visionary leaders to help think through that challenge. that same challenge is going to apply to you if you're a relatively smaller association, maybe representing a state trade group or society. The challenge is the same. So I think that's why we found so much consistency.
That makes sense. And to that end, when an association, a CEO is thinking about, their board, you think about individual board members, but you also have to think about the collective, right? And so I'm curious, the research told us a little bit about what strengths we should be looking for as the collective of the board. And you all are kind of touching on these here. Let's talk a little bit more about those. The four that we found were respect, trust, and candor. Candor being critical, I think, to come by. Diversity and leadership, courage to change, and dynamic learning. So any of you can jump in here. What about these really is resonating again for our folks here in 2023, right? Operating in a different environment.
Yeah, I'll start with that respect, candor, and trust piece of the puzzle. What we find consistently in association governance ecosystems is very high levels of respect. A lot of appreciation for the accomplishment and talent that volunteers bring to the governance ecosystem. And oftentimes fairly strong wells of trust as well, although that's less consistently present. We sort of find that there's two kinds of human beings in the world, those that default to giving trust and you can lose it, and those who default to requiring others to earn their trust. And we're not going to change people on that, but it is a part of the equation. Susanna teased a moment ago, the candor piece of the puzzle is what we find too often lacking in association governance. That willingness to really challenge one another's thinking and to respectfully and professionally be provocateurs, devil's advocates, just bring your honest differences of opinion to the conversation. And frankly, all too often the culture of the governance doesn't support healthy candor. So there's something to work on there, because if we're not going to optimize our strategic agility, our ability to respond to critical emerging issues, if we don't have sufficient candor across governance, that we're really talking about debating critical issues. So it sounds simplistic, but it's a growth area for almost every board with whom I've worked over years and years and years. So I just want to start there.
Yeah. And I'm happy to hop in for the next piece. I'm kind of connecting a thread between the second two that we found here, diverse leadership and courage to change. Yeah, the idea of, recognizing that you need diversity among your leadership teams and going and actively seeking it out is such a critical component. And I think bringing in this kind of diversity of experiences, of thought, people that that capture a range of knowledge within and inside and outside your current leadership team is critical. And I think that as a big catalyst when it comes to, building the courage to change. If you've had people that have been in the same seats, seeing the same things and all the same people that maybe are all from that have similar experiences, you're not going to maybe be challenged by outside thought to have, to look at change and think more about how, the courage that's necessary to make a shift in direction as needed and, deviate from historical practice as we found in this particular in the research. So that's just connecting those two things in particular, that two core strengths that I think are interconnected. I think all of these are interconnected, but those two stand out for me about, really being intentional about who you select to be leaders, what your characteristics are. I think we touched on this a little earlier, but and in making that space to what John mentioned, having that respect, trust, and candor, also sort of set up a safe space to challenge, previously held beliefs and, start moving in that direction of making changes as necessary. So that jumped out to me.
I want to jump in on the dynamic learning, because for me, it's an entree into a model that we frequently use around a healthy leadership dynamic in associations. And it is another, I didn't talk about respect, candor, and trust as a three-legged stool, but I'm going to talk about the three-legged stool here of insights, strategy, and governance, because I think it ties directly back to dynamic learning. There has to be a deep and sustained commitment to insights so data and interpretation of that data to ground learning and opportunity. Using that to drive strategy, and that's very familiar as a governance responsibility, but all too often doesn't have deep insights other than personal anecdotal experience behind it. So really needing insights to drive strategy. And then that connects over to governance, as you see on the slide. How do we organize ourselves to advance the priorities that we've identified in our strategy at a board level and at every other level of the organization? And a willingness in this sector, all too often, we have been unwilling to change our governance structures. I can't tell you how many, just looking at the list of people who are here, and I know a lot of these organizations, thoughts of changing governance are terrifying to many staff leaders for decent reasons. You go back to this model, it says we really need to be much more agile in how we organize ourselves to drive our strategy, and then learn from that, gather new insights, and keep the cycle going. That's dynamic learning, and that's really critical to effective governance. And I'm not only talking about at the board level, really at every level.
John, I want to add to that, and part of my thinking here, when I shared some of our reasoning behind the research, I mentioned that things are really changing quite quickly and rapidly nowadays. And governance and leadership was, of course, always extremely important to associations. But when you look at the situation we face now, where we are finding it more and more difficult to anticipate the kind of change that's coming at us on a day-to-day basis, not even on a year-to-year basis or month-to-month, we hit new types of issues at 3 a.m. in the morning that are going to distract us for months. And it's hard to even know where that's coming from. This type of leadership is something that isn't really a nice to have anymore. It's something that you need to have in order to navigate those times. To Tim's point about the importance of diversity of all types, including perspective and experiences and thought, having a broad base of leaders that have experience in different areas is going to help you understand where that change is coming from, and then how to represent people as well. So that is part of that stool also. And to tie it back to the point about data and insights, when you have really smart people making decisions, sometimes that's enough. They can navigate the storms that are in front of you because they have really good instincts. But if you add some data in there that can really reduce the risk behind your decision making, then you're really putting yourself, maybe you're not going to get every decision exactly right, but you're putting yourself in the best position possible. And that's all you can really ask of your leadership team and yourself. So those really come together in a powerful way.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Patrick. Leveraging data in order to build confidence in our decision making, even when the environment around us can be uncertain and tumultuous. Robert has a great question here in the Q&A that I want to jump to, and he's asking about how boards can self-evaluate around these traits. Tim, you've done recently some board assessment work. Tell us about what you're learning there.
Yeah, great question. This is pretty elusive sometimes. And so very, very important to, one, have your assessment be connected to data-driven insights. This is just something that seems obvious, but I think that's one connection point that we have. We're updating the assessments that we've been doing based on what we've just learned from this report. A hard stop. Having those very specific characteristics of what you're looking for in your board members and the board as a collective, and I think that's important. The individual assessment and the collective. It's really important to decide at what depth you will go, and just being aware that, and this already, I'm just saying it out loud to you all, that these assessments take time, and so you want to ask the most important questions and not try to cover it all. And I think it really does come down to evaluating which parts of these are most important to your board, and having that discussion with them. And then working through how you can measure true outcomes of what they're after in that assessment process. So it does get a little into the it depends category, but I do think grounding it in some very specific characteristics like we've kind of reported here, and then having that conversation with your board directly to make sure that you're on the same page and have a consensus on what that success looks like moving forward is really important.
Awesome. Well, let's turn a little bit more toward action. I think, these research is always interesting and great, and piques our intellect and our insights. But now I'm sure the folks on the webinar are thinking, like, what should I do with this? So John, let's start with you. What actions would you advise our association leaders to take as a result of this study?
Yeah, and I'm going to use Tim's last point as actually a segue into my answer here, is establish performance metrics across the organization. He cited the statistic from our study around only 37% have KPIs related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, we actually find that kind of there's just not enough time and attention paid to establishing performance metrics across all dimensions of the organization, including DE&I. And we understand, of course, that it can be tough to measure impact in mission-driven organizations. So much of what we're trying to do is big, conceptual, and transformational, and it's hard to on a quarterly or annual basis, find a metric that says how we're more completely fulfilling our mission. And we have to do it. We're working with a global medical organization that is just starting this work. The CEO has been there 10 years, great CEO, very successful organization. But frankly, even in a medical organization where members tend to love data, they're really just getting into driving performance metric creation, measurement, and analysis across the organization. It's a big deal. It's not easy, but when done right, it starts that insights, strategy, and governance cycle in a healthy place. It gives you information that helps you know when you need to pivot, when you need to stay the course, when you need to just grind out on something. So really leaning in on that more it's an actionable thing that everyone can do. And you don't have to do everything all at once. I mean, I think that's also a message here that strategic agility in your governance is important. And we're talking across all this conversation about the ideal. It's okay to pick a piece and just start, learn some things, and then scale. So metrics. The other thing that I will say is the data here said only 28% of organizations are giving annual charges to their committees. And that just, if we go back to our bicycle metaphor, we're deciding priorities in the front wheel, but 3/4 of the time not telling the back wheel anything about it. I'm being dramatic, but the data say we're just not driving clarity around what we need to produce, what outcomes we need to accomplish to the folks who are, in many instances, doing the work to deliver results. So there's a real opportunity to more tightly combine priorities with the charges of folks who are passionate, dedicated, hardworking volunteers who want to make a difference, but we need alignment. And 3/4 of the time, that's not happening right now. So how can you think about governance board communicating to committees and task forces? Here's what we need from you this year, and here's how we're going to measure it. Let's talk about what you need to be successful with that. So it sounds simplistic, but there's a real opportunity there.
Yes, very actionable. Tim, what would you add to that?
Yeah, love it. All about the metrics that matter. And one of the pieces that I have in mind is related to that. And it's specifically an element of that we go through each year with our boards. It's the board orientation. That's one specific area that I'm zoned in on, right? It's when you bring in virtually or in person leadership into your organization. Maybe they've already been active volunteers, they go down the election process, whatever your governance model might be. When you're introducing new people to, say, your board of directors, how can you think about setting up that person with the strategic focus that's necessary to be strategically agile, as we report in this research? And I think these orientations of board members, it's both for new board members, but I think there's still an opportunity for current board members to really receive some of this, the latest training of saying, here's what the research show, here's what the data show, and say, this is what being strategically agile, this is what a strategic focus looks like. And really one thing in particular, I did these for years when I was on the association side, we have board members come in, we have staff go in and report about all the activities and the outputs that have been produced and all the things we're capable of. That often will set the wrong expectations for new board members who see that and they go, you're telling me all about that back wheel? That's great. I do that in my business. I'd like to focus on that thing because it's relatable. It's something they're used to focusing on. I think that right there is one very specific area that you could go back, look at your next board orientation, or your next orientation with your broader volunteer leadership, and look at how you report back sort of the outcomes of what these different departments have done on specific strategic priorities versus saying the capabilities and the activities. And I think it's a little subtle, but it's so important because I've gone through so many versions of this, and I know you have as well. That's a way to set up the expectations up front of what you think they should be focused on, and what the research says they should be focused on. So that's one thing in particular that stands out. And one other area is the recruitment and retention of strategically minded board members. I think having the conversation about, all right, when we look for new board members, what are those characteristics that we're looking for, and have documenting them if you aren't already. That should be one very important thing on your list. But really walking through those specific characteristics we lay out here, so you can be intentional about, okay, we already have, we have this representation on the board. We have these kind of strategic thinkers on the board. We could use some more strategic thinkers in this particular area. And really just walking through that together to get that documented. So the next round of recruiting board members, volunteer leaders, people for micro volunteering opportunities, that you have this sort of layout of what you need in the system to be strategically agile, and you proactively recruit them. And it's just a really critical part that I think you can take action on, today, and not have to wait on some of that. So that's another one that really stands out to me.
Excellent. We are getting closer to the end of our time here, but I do have a few questions from the chat. As a reminder, if you've got something for our panelists here, go ahead and drop it in. Some of them we're answering real time, and I'm grabbing a couple for us to talk about here live. So Patrick, a question for you around what potential issues or topics future boards might be facing that are going to require really the strategic vision and are quite urgent, are near term for us all.
Yeah, thank you, Susanna, for that question. It's something that's top of mind for me. There are a lot, and I think you could start with what John mentioned on artificial intelligence. You could think about associations and the desire to develop new revenue streams for the association. There are just so many things that associations need to grapple with now. The changing nature of work and the professionals or the industries that you represent. What are those going to look like in a couple of years? And should you be evolving how you even think about your membership based on that? The one issue that is really fresh and top of mind for me, John and I just left the conversation with about 40 CEOs. And we were discussing how there are real divergent belief systems within association memberships today. People that feel one way, another group of people that feel another. And what is the role of the CEO and the governance structure in helping to navigate those? And although it might seem, I don't think that it would seem simple to anyone on this webinar, but it might seem simple from the outside that, well, you clarify your values and you're able to move forward. It's often a lot more nuanced than that. And so even identifying what issues are going to pop up in your space in the next 12 months, do your leaders in government structure even have an interest in talking about those issues, or would they prefer to avoid them? And then rather than sort of picking a side, but doing the messy work of really exploring that, that is going to be an important set of qualities for the board and the governance structure to have in the coming months. We're heading into an election season. Issues that are politicized today, to a certain degree, are going to go through the roof. And without really strong strategic leaders that are able to see around corners and understand how this might affect the whole of the membership and be able to move forward on that and have the desire to, it's going to be really important, I think.
John, Tim, what would you add in there?
Well, I'll take it a slightly different angle. You can start no matter how your governance is currently performing in your estimation. And, we're working a group right now that has a 450-person House of Delegates. Some of you just got chills up your spine, like, please no, never make me operate in that governance environment. But it's not about elimination. It's about how can we help that group be more strategic and clear on their contribution to the governance systems. Another group we're working with right now, it literally takes 2 years to change bylaws. And that's, again, sort of terrifying to many of us, and it is probably suboptimal as a fair way to describe that. And we're still working on making some change there. A real world example that Chris Buskey, the CEO of the Infectious Disease Society of America, has worked for a number of years now on evolving their governance, and they've done it in waves. They started before COVID. Think about infectious disease doctors during COVID. They had some other things on their mind, but they still have managed to make layers of really powerful change across their governance and have a journal article, data-driven journal article that pulls for the evidence of the impact, the positive impacts of their governance change that a volunteer leader actually opted to create and publish. So my message here is, no matter what, if you've got a 32-person board of directors that loves to micromanage, you can still work towards strategic agility. If you've got a 400-some person House of Delegates, you can still work towards strategic agility, a piece at a time, a step at a time. But it is possible to make a difference. So I want everyone to feel some hope that we can make a difference.
Yeah, great example, John. And one thing jumped out, you just mentioned that the data-driven element, and a recent project Patrick and I worked on where we did some research ahead of a strategic planning process. And there was one particular area. They're like, this one issue is really glaring. This organization was in the news, and they're like, the public really, they really care about this. It's affecting our business. And it was a lot of anecdotal stuff. And we conducted this broad study and found that this, thing that they thought was, a critical top 2 issue didn't rank. Honestly, it was so low based on the research we got that it was really a loud, the loud minority group, specifically, like those few people that make the most noise in particular. But we had the data-driven insights that helped inform the discussion and the prioritization of the strategic plan itself. And so it's critical, that the potential issues and linking that to, you go find out what they really are with some regularity among your audiences, members, customers, attendees, whatever. It's data driven, making sure you balance that out and really lead with that in particular over some of the anecdotal and some of the things that, as things get political and it gets noisy out there on the news, you really need to ground yourself in some of this data.
I'm going to pull on
Sure.
it's a thread again, because Patrick mentioned it and Tim just referenced it again, and it clearly is present in our society more broadly. I don't think any of us think it's going away in the near term. And so there are particular leadership challenges, particular challenges to governance in the association world, where the norm in our ecosystem has been consensus, that we want everyone to be happy, that we really are around uniting through our associations around an issue or a topic or a profession that is shared across the group. And suddenly we have divisive points of view on different things that are causing dissonance in systems that aren't used to a lot of dissonance like that. I mean, it's always been there, there's politics, but this is at a whole different scale. I think we all agree. What's that mean for strategic agility in your governance? How do you do this when you've got people all over the place? And, I think there's a leadership question here around how to navigate it and understand that maybe our norms of trying to please everyone aren't going to be as achievable going forward as they once were. And how do we still govern effectively through all of it? We still have duties to advance the well-being of the organization. It's a tricky time. No one has all the answers. All the more reason to lean in on making sure your governance is as responsive and attuned to what's coming down the pipe, what the data tells you around where people are and where they want you to go, and then making the tough calls, because this is a time of tough calls that have to be made. Want to get that in there.
Yes. This is really insightful. And one other question that has popped up, Patrick, I'll pose this to you because it's a little bit around, kind of what we learned in our data set. Scott is asking about if we have a sense of best practices when a board is comprised of volunteers, or if there's a significant difference when board members are paid. I'm curious if you have any insights into that or advice for Scott as he's navigating his board.
That's a really interesting question. I'll acknowledge I may not be the best person on this call to answer that question. So I want to check in with John and Tim if you have a response before I offer my thoughts.
Well, I think we know from the demographics of survey respondents that this particular study was grounded, 95% of the respondents were CEOs, so they were paid staff, presumably paid. And I suspect almost all are probably working with volunteer leaders, not paid leaders, but that's an assumption I'm making. Patrick, do you have data to the contrary on that?
No, these were certainly paid staff that were responding, and I think the more normative boards that they were representing were volunteer. Now, in terms of how that might vary, I suspect that if you do have a volunteer board, that your legacy governance structures may provide a more powerful role in who you're able to select versus a paid board. And so the best practices might not be so much in terms of what's important to have in the board, but the amount of flexibility that you have and how you can go out and select. So in the latter case, it might position you a little bit more to really compose that board and maybe larger governance structure in a way that reflects the qualities that we're talking about today. Not sure if there are other best practices that occur to you, John or Tim, but that's the main one that pops for me.
I'll just quickly say that looking at whether you call it competencies or lived experiences or talents that people bring to the table, it is a different exercise in a volunteer setting than when there's a financial return involved. It's a hiring decision either way, but the dynamics around it are very different. And it's part of what makes governance in our world tricky, because we take people who volunteer, but we still have to be thinking about the skills and experiences they bring to the table, just as we would when we make a staff hiring decision. So that's a tough thing to navigate.
Yeah, and I would underscore too that our research was with CEOs, again, that paid staff component. And a big part of what drove us to do this study is because we believe that associations are different. And so much of the thought leadership out there is about for-profit boards. And that is where you see the paid board member model more frequently. So what you tend to see more frequently in associations is the volunteer model. And that dynamic is really different. It's different for a variety of reasons. But not the least of which is the passion and the individuality that people bring to their volunteerism, which frankly, is what has always made associations so interesting to me. But I think that is one of the fundamental differences about this report, is that it really does shine a light on why association governance is different. And I'm sure we all read the articles from Deloitte and Harvard Business Review and other places, and you get those insights, you get those ideas, but you think, how does this really, I'm not really sure if this translates exactly to associations. And that was a big driver for us in this study. So beginning to understand kind of why are associations different? So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Before we go, we want to offer you all an opportunity to go even deeper in this discussion with our team. On the screen, you see a QR code, and that's going to take you to a scheduling link where you can find a time that works for you to talk one-on-one with our team. You'll see some options over the next few weeks to make an appointment and talk more with us. We will also be sending out the recording of the webinar that will be landing in your inboxes. Feel free to share that with others in your organization or others in your network. You can also go back to the information we covered today in more detail if you like. Finally, if you are looking for a copy of the report, you can find that on our website at mckinleyadvisors.com. You can download a copy of the report and read in much more detail about the topics that we talked about today. Thanks again to our team here, John, Patrick, and Tim. It's been great to chat with you. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.